Hello everyone, this is update for November 28, 2024, day 1009 of the war, end of the date update. Also catch up since the last video, which was November 24th. So I'm gonna uh, focus a little bit on Russia today, and then I'm gonna switch to the situation on battlefield in Ukraine, as I always do. So first, I was a little bit talking about in a prior video about problems in Russian economy, and it seems that actually those, let's say, problems that were to some extent invisible to majority are becoming visible to everyday person and affecting sort of life of everyday person. So there was quite a bit of panic in Russia in terms of their FX market and Russian ruble, Russian currency depreciated significantly relatively to US dollar and euro. So as you can see at the top of the panic, Russian ruble was as low as 114. Then eventually, Russian central bank, Russian president, and political top threw some water on the fire uh, and Russian ruble stabilized somewhere around like 108 per one US dollar. Just for reference, Russian central bank managed to stabilize Russian ruble around like 91, 92 under pressure from Russian president about a year ago, plus minus, could be wrong. So this is, as you can see, from 90, let's say 91 or 92, jumped to 108. And I'm not talking about 114, but 1.8. It's a significant devaluation of the currency, which obviously affecting everyday life of every Russian citizen. And the how it's tied to the situation that I was discussing before, where the war economy is basically sucking all of the resources from the civilian economy, and it creates significant inflationary pressures. So, and I mentioned that Russian central bank was managing the situation by increasing interest rates significantly to up to, I think, 21% annual. This is rate for commercial banks, right? So the commercial banks will add their margin, so the rate for the end borrower is going to be much higher. So I don't know, it's probably closer to 30%, probably mid 20s. I don't have exact numbers, but that's directionally has to be correct. And so that way, central bank was managing inflation, so the prices don't go up. So this kind of, but you cannot manage that. You cannot sort of control that situation because it blows up in other way, and it blew up um, through the Russian currency, right? So you cannot hide this sort of exploding grenade in your pocket and thinking that somehow you can suppress it through interest rates. So because the fact that Russian currency went down significantly, as you can see, from roughly 91, 92 to 108. This really means inflation through different means, right? Because all of the foreign goods are going to become less available to everyday Russian citizens, and given that a lot of the food stuff was imported, because what happened, you have relatively limited production capacity, at least in the short term of year, 2 years, 3 years. And if you shift that production capacity towards uh, making military goods, you don't have obviously capacity to produce enough consumer goods. And so what was happening, there are two things where, and so you could create inflation for consumer goods throughout the economy. The obviously the most important is are sorry food, basically things that people need to eat, because that really can create very easily social unrest. So what Russia was doing, they were importing a lot of different food products that were sort of went missing in Russia, and specifically, I think I was mentioning about eggs, butter from time to time. So they found suppliers from outside of Russia. I think it was like Azerbaijan, Turkey, Belarus. Basically, there's obviously everybody. There's um, opportunistic suppliers who are willing to earn money, and especially apparently margin is pretty good. So why not? And so this is how Russia was managing this situation. And that allowed sort of to extend. It's like you juggling many balls in the air, and eventually you're not going to be able to keep all of those balls in the air, and they start to fall. And we might be seeing that situation in Russia. So, and because all of this, food, specifically food stuff that was imported, so now it hits Russian consumer again directly, because the prices for all of that imported food stuff are going to go up, and they're very critical, as you can imagine. Eggs and butter are probably one of the more important items in a diet of everyday person, and especially if you want to have relatively healthy diet. And so, so they, even though Russian central bank was trying to suppress prices for this exact goods so they don't go up, so they're gonna go up anyways because the valuation of Russian currency. So one way or another, it's like you have two roads. Anyways, they all lead to the same destination of regular citizen, regular consumer have their standard of living declining. And that's really a direct consequence of war. And as I stated, the whole idea was to hide this whole situation or pretend that this is not as acute, not as problematic, and eventually you cannot, you cannot hide that for too long. In some ways, this is probably the most dangerous situation for Russian government in terms of everything else what's going on in Russia. Military-wise, Russia managed to basically turn the situation in its favor in Ukraine. So Ukraine now is clearly losing, and so the only real threat is actually internal stability due to economic situation. And then again, I'm not trying to say, oh, Russia is going to fall apart tomorrow. This is obviously false. But this might be the only driver right now that forces Russian government and generally Russian political ruling class, let's put this way, to have a negotiation with respect to Ukraine, because otherwise, Russian ruling class has exactly zero incentive to have any negotiations and peace in Ukraine, just because they're winning. Why would you? And clearly winning, and to the point that Ukrainian forces are on the brink of large-scale collapse. So if you sense that, you see what's happening, there's no incentive to sit at the table, at the negotiation tables, and that's what we're seeing, where there's rhetoric, we're open to peace, but the real sort of side of the story is Russia is willing to have peace on their terms, which really means that they control most of the Ukraine. And obviously for Ukraine it's not acceptable. And I'm not even referring to Ukrainian ruling class, which is absolutely incompetent and unfit. And I would say that's a real reason of Ukraine having problems. But before we go to that sort of Ukrainian part, I'm gonna want to show a little bit what's happening in Russian, I would say, manufacturing. And manufacturing, I'm talking about very widely everything, including food stuff, pretty much everything. So this is actually interesting chart that was created inside of Russia, where they actually look at the manufacturing, but in the number of actual units. So it's not value, which usually means price times quantity. This is, we're looking only at the quantity. So price is removed, so you don't have effect of inflation, which usually hides real situation. In some ways it's basically kind of like can paint you false picture. So this is really quantity, because in the end we're all consuming quantity of something, quantity of food, quantity of whatever, clothing, quantity of anything, right? So we don't care about, in the end, we don't care about the currency, how much currency we consume. We consume actual, real, physical products, and that's why it's important, and it's actually really correct way to look at the situation. So this chart shows a change in the manufacturing in physical goods, physical quantitative look at the manufacturing from June to September of 2024. This is the change. So in some ways it's a little bit dated, but it kind of gives perspective of how things are sort of moving in Russia. So so anything above so this is 0. Anything above 0 is expanded over this, what I think 3 months time. Anything below has declined. So as you can see, there's a significant portion of Russian industry that actually is declining. But let's have a look first at, and then also this is percentage of the total manufacturing from 0 to 100%, and how much each sector is taking within that 100%. So it's kind of quite informative, because you're not only seeing industries that are going up or down, but also how important they are in the total, big picture in the total industry. So if we look at what's going on, what's expanding actually in Russia is, first of all, is clothing manufacturing, and I can tie this to manufacturing of the uniform for the war effort. So that's probably most likely a reason for all of this. Then the next big part is shipbuilding and aerospace building. So everything related to warcraft, military ships, everything, all of that. So as you can see, that's actually a pretty significant portion, and that actually shows that the focus, interestingly, focus of Russian ruling class is actually not on making, let's say, more tanks, but actually making more aircraft, making more ships, and probably this includes also missiles. So focus is a little bit different, probably not as apparent if you don't look at these numbers. Then another item that expanding is production of the equipment to actually make goods. So it's basically machine building. So that's probably driven by the fact that Russia has problems with importing a lot of machines or equipment to make whatever they need to make, or for military efforts. So they attempting to replace those that lost import with making it internally. This is other, so it's not unclear. Then electronics and optics. Again, this is something that's Russia having problem importing. So this is again military effort. So you can see this, pretty much all of this is really driven by military effort. Then the next one is products made from metal. So it's kind of very vague and sort of, I would say, unclear. So I would say this can include many things, including making heavy military equipment, sort of more like tanks, more traditional one. cannons and so on. But again, this is somewhat hypothesizing. And then the only first thing that we see here that's food item is beverages. Again, could tie this to this problems with importing all sort of like sugary beverages such as Pepsi Cola, Coca Cola, and so on. That's Russia having problem. They to the point that they actually importing it from things like from Iran, from Afghanistan, and so on. So this might be the result of that boost. So there's, basically this is production of addictive substances for the consumer. So consumer kind of like sedated by the basically by narcotics essentially. Then refined oil products. That's again important for war effort, but also important for the export. Actually, Russia is exporting quite a bit of refined petroleum product and so on. And then chemical products again. This is important for war efforts, such as explosive, gunpowder, and so on. So all of this stuff that's we're seeing here, more or less, with some exception, obviously, with this beverages, is tied to the war effort. What is another interesting part is that production of the other food is actually declining in Russia. So as you can see, this is what I was being referring to, that there is not enough capacity, and if you put too much into war effort, something has to give, and that includes including production of the food stuff. There's also other things that are in decline, and I would say, for example, production of paper, and that's probably more related with the problems of export, of Russian export that is blocked. So that's declining. Ores, or sort of ores, again, this probably problems with export. Then another important part is oil and gas production, and this probably mostly related to natural gas production, because Russia has essentially Gazprom is collapsed, and they don't have really markets or in the size that they need. It's small, tiny portion. So that whole industry is essentially is dead, at least for now. The other sort of industries are this is building materials again. So if you have a problem, if you focus on the war, people just simply don't have money to build their own sort of houses and so on. Actually, interestingly, coal production is down. Also, equipment for power generation. Actually, sorry, I apologize. This is actually power generation is down, so which is actually surprising. Then pharmaceuticals, which Russia is having problems, and specifically with precursors. They were importing a lot of them, and now they don't have that. So again, you have naturally decline because you don't have inputs in your production, and it's really not easy to rebuild that capacity. So you have that, and then furniture is down, textiles are down. So then the other important part is, as you can see, metals. That is actually very interesting because you kind of need that, but at the same time, it is down significantly. And then the other important part is car manufacturing. So basically, consumer cars. That industry is essentially dead in Russia because Russia never had its own, and it's essentially foreign manufacturers were producing cars inside of Russia, but they used a lot of imported components, and so not that whole industry is dead essentially. So that's in a nutshell. So as you can see, this. With some exceptions, some logical exceptions, which is blocked export markets, but the rest of it is essentially consumer goods are in decline, and this kind of shows how the whole war effort is changing economy and how things working in the economy. Now I'm gonna move a little bit to situation in Ukraine, and actually want to discuss a little bit this Russian attack by hypersonic missile Oreshnik. So what is very clear is that Russia can use it again wherever they feel they need to do that. At the same time, I think there's a lot of attempts to sort of catastrophize the situation, because there were actually, for example, Russian president, I think the day ago so was saying that the attack will depend on the situation, on the circumstances. The way it was actually translated, that attack is going to happen, it's imminent, and so on. Especially, and in particular, it was saying that it was that attack was going to happen against the Ukrainian political center or the government, top governmental institutions, and so on. So there's a lot of attempts to make sort of like hysteria around this situation, but as I stated before, we're far away from nuclear war, but there's definitely we're on the path to escalation. There's no question about that. But sort of positive side is that Russian political top is clearly not determined to use nuclear weapons unless there is very clear, credible threat. And whatever was happening so far, it's not real, meaningful, clear, credible threat for Russia, including these attacks against Russian military assets on the Russian territory. Everybody understands that this is, I would say, expected and sort of normal course of war. The same as Russia is attacking military assets and installations on the Ukrainian side. The only difference in sort of Russian approach is, and showing some impatience, is this renewed attacks by Russia against Ukrainian power distribution network, which they had couple at this point, and situation worsened significantly in Ukraine. So, but that's more related to Russia's effort to influence public opinion in Ukraine and to make people agree to, I would say, unfavorable or disastrous peace agreement for Ukraine. So far, Ukrainian population is not supporting that, even though there are some, I would say, fake polling was done just to sort of share that in the Western media. So far, internal polling is not showing the same result, and that Ukrainian population is willing to sort of settle by losing significant portion of territory. Not to mention that Russia at this point is not even willing to stop. And that's, I think, is very important part, is for some reason it's being presented in the West and some people in Ukraine, is that Russia is willing to stop at this point. There is no indication of that. And from Russian perspective, if, let's say, we were to believe what was presented, is that Ukraine joining NATO is existential threat to Russia, then from a territorial perspective, Russia needs to control majority of Ukraine. The where they may stop could be Western Ukraine, is in the sort of best case scenario for Ukraine. Otherwise, Russia prefers to control entire of the Ukraine, and then, if possible, Moldova. But so far, Moldova managed to escape because there were sort of pro-Western leader was re-elected with variously majority. Sorry, In some ways, it was just a luck. But nevertheless, the Moldova is still sort of gravitating towards west. But what I'm trying to explain is that what is being presented, that Russia is willing to settle with just controlling these territories that it captured so far in Ukraine, is doesn't even make sense from a logical perspective, because from Russian perspective, the most dangerous part, that the closest to, let's say, Moscow, is this northeastern part of Ukraine, right, which Russia does not control at this moment. And so if you really want to prevent any kind of threat from Ukraine, perceived threat, right, so then you really need to control at least eastern side of Dnipro River throughout the entire, at the minimum. And most likely you would want to create a buffer as far as going to controlling up to Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia region of Ukraine. So at most, Russia would be willing to sort of like give away, call it, all of this part, like Western Ukraine, which I wouldn't even say that that's really going to happen, but I'm just hypothesizing. So it doesn't even make sense. So just having Russia control these territories, all it really means that there will be sort of next attempt, next wave, and then at that point Ukraine will fold very, very quickly. So the other sort of narrative that is being pushed in the West that I would like to address is that the problem is Ukraine's problem is because there's not enough soldiers being recruited and so on. So that's really not a problem. The problem is really motivation. People are not motivated to fight for Ukrainian political class, for the system that they built, which completely disenfranchises overwhelming majority of the population. It's correctly called oligarchic system that serves very few, who basically control political power in Ukraine. And so people simply not willing to fight for that. It's essentially, I would almost, it's probably oversimplification, primitivization, but you can call it feudal system. So people are not willing to fight for feudal system. And that's really the essence of the problem. It's not a problem of how many people recruited. Ukrainian army nominally has 1 million people. Russia has, let's say, between 600 to 700 people on the ground in Ukraine. So nominally, Ukrainian army is larger. But on the front line, it actually flips. And there are fewer Ukrainian soldiers than Russian. And very simple reason is because two main sources of that is desertions that are as high as 200,000. So technically, on paper, you have 1 million, but remove already 200. That's desertions. And then significant portion of the rest is simply stuffed up in some rear units throughout Ukraine that essentially doing nothing. So that's another 300, 400. So really on the front line, and this is very rough estimate. This doesn't, in some way, based on anecdotal evidence. Roughly, you have like 400,000 people. So you have fewer than on the front line than Russian army, and even those people are not motivated, right? So they retreat at the because, and for good reasons. So they're not motivated, but on top of that, they have terrible leadership, incompetent. Lack of coordination between the units, lack of, let's say, artillery support when it's needed, all sort of, say, the army is simply not working as a system as it should be. And so this is really the reason of this collapsing Ukrainian defenses, and just simply calling more people, it's not going to solve anything. So, okay, let's plan this out, like, okay, or see how it's going to play out in the future. You call more people, so there will be more deserters, more people who simply stay in the rear, and let's say you increase a little bit by 50,000, 100,000 on the front line. It buys you time, let's say 6 months, and then what else? And then front line anyways collapses in 6 months. So this is very clearly strategy that goes nowhere, and not addressing actual root cause of the problems is going to make this impending collapse extremely phenomenal and very sort of, I would say, educational. Um, Now let's switch to the walk through the front line in a clockwise fashion, the way I always do, starting from the Ukrainian bridgehead in Russia's Kursk region, and Russian troops continuing pressure, continue squeezing Ukrainian forces from the Kursk region of Russia. That's general message. There's lack of objective data where exactly Ukrainian Russian troops are. So I'm not trying to even like to paint it perfectly, because there's simply no objective data. There's general sort of, how to say, directional data that there's this still fight going on around this Novoivanivka. That's the key sort of tension area right now, and then Russian troops are continuing to sort of regain village by village, slowly but surely. Now let's look at the situation north and northeast of Kharkiv. Things more or less stable. There's no major sort of movements by either side. The only, let's say, never-ending situation is Russian aircraft attacks, or basically using gliding bombs to basically destroy this town of Vovchansk. Beyond that, there is nothing major going on here. Now let's look at the North Lugansk front line. Things here are pretty, I would say, moving in a negative direction, which is not a surprise for Ukraine. Russian troops managed to cross the Oskil River north of Kupyansk and establish bridgehead there, which obviously very negative development. I would say to extent not surprising, and the only reason that was possible is because there are holes in Ukrainian defenses that they're without Ukrainian soldiers, and that goes back to what I was discussing before, and that's direct consequence of how the front line is collapsing. So just simply, Russian troops are seeking out these holes, and then they attack. They move into those sort of emptiness essentially, and that's why sometimes you see this kind of like a narrow advances, is just because they found a hole, they moved inside of the hole, and then they just kind of like expanding it from the sides. It's very sort of straightforward primitive tactic, but it works because of Ukrainian weakness. It's not a result of Russia's strength, but it's result of Ukrainian weakness. It's sort of the opposite situation to what was happening in, let's say, fall of 2022, where Ukrainian success was not really a result of truly Ukrainian effort, but it was result of Russian failure. So in some ways, this is happening right now on the front line. Otherwise, there are no major losses or Russian advances south of Kupyansk. Now let's move to the North Donbass front line. The northern part is fairly quiet, and as I mentioned before, it's very clear Russian command also does not have enough resources to attack everywhere. The only place where there is major fighting is going on is in Chasiv Yar. There is factory there that's producing specialized bricks, and so the whole fight is for that factory right now. And with the loss of that factory, essentially Chasiv Yar is going to be lost, and Ukrainian troops will retreat, and that will push all of the. This will mean that factor really will mean this whole area, this whole defensive line here is going to collapse, and Ukrainian forces will have to retreat all the way to Konstantinivka and essentially the line up north. So that's going to be major sort of collapse. When that happens, because as I explained, because of the situation on the Ukrainian side, this is inevitable. This just giving enough time. That's where things are moving here. Now let's look at the situation on the central Donbass front line, where things, I would say, nearly catastrophic. Russian troops continuing their advance. They closer and closer to capturing Kurakhove, or basically forcing withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Kurakhove. And let's actually, at the same time, it's probably not as clear on this sort of large scale map, so I'll show you a little bit sort of more detailed map. So first, Russian troops managed to breach Ukrainian defenses and capture village Zhovte, as you can see here. Again, the same story is essentially they found unmanned hull in Ukrainian defenses and advanced through it. And so that's how this, very kind of like pointed move is just result of that. So as you can see, this already creates problem for Pokrovsk. Essentially, in the long run, Pokrovsk is going to be lost, but this is not immediate direct threat for Pokrovsk. It's more threat to the situation south, to the south, and actually really moving much closer to the next Ukrainian region, which is Dnipropetrovsk region. So this is already border with Dnipropetrovsk region, as you can see. So there's Russian troops are not that far away. So, but this was another example of collapsing Ukrainian defenses here. There is fierce fighting going on for this village Pushkine, which again, the same is going to happen. The goal is to move and to cut this road from Pokrovsk to the south, Novolenivka. Then the more important part is that at this point, Russian troops managed to capture village Berestke here. So the next, the last, I would say, stronghold of Ukrainian troops is this village Stari Terny. If this village is going to be lost, Ukrainian forces simply will be forced to immediately withdraw from the Kurakhove. Whatever Ukrainian forces at this point control less than half of the town, but the important part that they still control power generation facility, which is very good defensive position, generally speaking. But at this point, if Stari Terny falls, that whole defensive position is going to collapse pretty quickly. Now let's move to situation on the Zaporizhya front line. Things here are more or less stable, but for simpler reason that Russian forces are shifted their focus, and they are essentially now attempting to capture this Velyka Novosilka. So as I mentioned, they had success in the past week with capturing Razdolne and then moving here north towards north and basically west of Velyka Novosilka, essentially creating sort of pincer-like movement which will force withdrawal from Velyka Novosilka. Now let's finish with the last section of the front line along Dnipro River, and things here are quiet for a very simple reason I mentioned before, is that both sides don't have resources to continue fighting here. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Till next time. Bye bye.